Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team video. Today I'm going over my terrain guide update where I'll be updating my, guide for how to place terrain and boards based on the new Critcal Operations rules, including some board layouts you can use for yourself. But before we get into things, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of today's guide. Did you find it useful or helpful? How did you find the update, and was there anything I missed? And remember, if you want to give me some more support, I've got a Discord down in the episode description for free, as well as an affiliate link at Element Games and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. But yeah, today I'm going to go over my terrain guide and just update it based on, the Critcal Operations update with some added terrain layouts. So this is actually something I've been meaning to do for a while that I've just been very delayed with because of myself. But, better late than never. So let's get into it. So when it comes to setting up boards, once again, you have to choose if you want symmetrical or asymmetrical. Personally, I'm a big fan of asymmetrical boards. They're more interesting and they give a benefit to actually being the defender, because generally if you do asymmetrical boards, you can design one side or one part of the board that may have a slight advantage over the other side. So at least when you're the defender, you actually have an advantage for picking your side of the board first. Because if you look at symmetrical boards, they're easier to design, but one of the biggest downsides of Into the Dark is all the layouts for competitive players symmetrical. So as a defender, you just kind of suck. You just go well, just have to take this side. It is easier for people who don't want to switch around, but generally asymmetrical boards are better and they're more interesting to play and watch. So that's my big tip there. Always place your objective markers first. It's what the core rules say, because the biggest issue you're going to have is you set the terrain and then you try and put the objectives under. It's much easier if you do it the other way around. And especially if you're using your map and you find, it actually doesn't cover the objectives or covers them too much. Maybe I'll just tweak it around there to make it actually better to play on. So always do that first. And, once you've figured out placing the objectives first and then gone with an asymmetrical board, then you can easily move on from those steps. So the other big thing when it comes to designing boards is always ensure that Tac Ops are scorable. So the biggest Tac Ops that you have to remember is secure vantage. So this has changed. So old vantage was you can't score it on buildings vantage points that are within the drop zone, even if it's just a small part of them. This time they have to be more than blue from the drop zone to be scorable. So what I like to do is make sure there's at least 2 vantage points that are more than blue from each drop zone, so that secure vantage is actually scorable, because the worst thing is playing on a board where you actually can only get 1 point from it and can't max it. And then the other one is central control. So you want to ensure that you don't put a big piece of terrain within blue of the center of the board. So there are some times when you can't, like when using Morocco terrain, but generally, you want to keep that center of the board actually not completely blocked off. And even when it comes to the Morocco, landing pad, that's only 2 inches tall. So you can actually technically still score secure central control. But keeping those Tac Ops in mind are the biggest ones, because they're important parts of key archetypes. So you don't want to design boards where all of a sudden you've placed only one vantage point in the middle and the rest of the vantage points are within blue of drop zone, so they actually can't score unless they travel all the way across the board, making it kind of impossible. And then you do want terrain in the middle, but not so much that it completely blocks off the middle. So those are the important terrain Tac Op tips to remember. Next, it's keeping drop zones safe. So as always, you want at least 2 pieces, I would say, of heavy in the drop zone, or 1 big piece of heavy with obscuring terrain in front of it, just to keep someone safe. Because the issue is, I've seen a lot of maps where the drop zones are really, really open. There's either 1 big piece of heavy or 1 piece of heavy, and the rest are just flanked by vantage points that can easily be accessed. You don't want shooting galleries from either drop zone. Yeah, you want safe drop zones so people can actually move up. There's been a weird pushback against that lately, and I don't understand why. It's not a skill to immediately go first activation, I move dash onto this vantage point and blow you up. That's not really fun or fair, and it's not really a show of skill. It's just going oh look, my kill team can do that and you can't, and I just nuke you, noob tube you from the deployment. So don't do that. That's a big no-no. Also when you're putting stuff in the drop zone, don't put it so far back so the heavy terrain is 2 to 3 inches into the drop zone, because at that point it's a hindrance, because now you're sacrificing being safe over being actually able to push into the boards. So you don't just want heavy terrain on the drop zone edge, you want it on the drop zone edge. You don't want it deeper in, pushing people back, because otherwise, you know, you should be safe from your deployment, unless it's like you have to put everyone in engaged. You should be allowed to stay safe and then move up and make riskier moves on the mid board. So those are the biggest things. And, you know, you actually kind of do want to keep vantage points. I find the perfect thing is putting vantage points either open facing the opponent, or if they're not open, more than like blue, just over blue, so like 3.5 inches away from a drop zone to counteract dashing, right? So I'll combine this with the scouting things as well, because the other thing about keeping drop zone safe, you don't want to design a drop zone where there's a vantage point looking into the enemy drop zone, but then they can just put a fortified barricade on there and then be completely safe, like move up there and go, like, I can just shoot you with a silent guy. What you ideally want to do is keep vantage points that are facing, in terms of the light cover facing towards the opponent, more than blue from the drop zone. And if they're in the drop zone, like on the edge, they're open. In that terms, and what I mean by that is where, you know, the vantage point or the cover is actually facing towards your own drop zone, and towards the opponent there's nothing. So if you do go up there for a risky shot, you're not getting cover, and you're either sacrificing a barricade to put up there and do so. But those are my tips for that. And now I'll get on to showing off some board tips for placing terrain and types of terrain you can use for your own boards. So as you can see for the board here, this is kind of showing off what I mean when you have vantage points that are more than blue from the enemy drop zone, as well as a central heavy piece of terrain which provides obscuring. So as you can see here, this heavy oil tower, you know, the walls work as well, but ideally when you're looking at the mid board, this is a Hotdog deployment board, so it's vertical deployment drop zones. But with this heavy tower in the way, as you can see, there are clear fire lanes in the middle of the board from here to here, right? But because there's a heavy piece of terrain in the middle, even if you're unengaged, because of the obscuring rules of heavy terrain, it means there's no free shot. Yeah, you can kind of negate it if you move up and fire on engage next to the oil tower, but then there's actually forcing you to come forward to the opponent. Obviously, if you have ways to ignore obscuring, that's an issue in itself. But this is what I'm talking about when you've got central pieces, you know. And even here, assuming there was some way to get an angle, like if you could get an angle in the bottom corner by the scrap pile, depending on the cover lines, you'd still be obscured. So it's really important to get enough obscuring in the middle of the board. Generally, the oil rig is really good, but long pieces like the Octarius walls are really great. So generally, when I play Octarius boards, as you'll see when I talk about the layouts, these two vantage points have their vantage point blocked off, so they're just basically heavy walls. And long heavy walls are the best pieces you can put in the mid board. And when I generally make Octarius maps, I try and switch it around instead of just having always the oil rig in the middle. It just suits being in the middle for most maps. But there's lots of really good replacements for this. Obviously, Octarius is the standard, but even the walls in the Morocco, just anything heavy that's L or even U-shaped, you know. But that's one good thing about Chaunaf. So that's why I'm trying to not be too standard when it comes to terrain. But ideally, when you're setting up terrain, you do want something in the midboard. Like even these two heavy pieces here and here, they're not actually in the drop zone because the drop zone line is here. And the same here. So you've got enough pieces of heavy to hide behind, but they're actually some forward pieces of heavy terrain that provide more obscuring, so it's safer for you to move up. Because some things I see in a lot of maps that people make or that, you know, they come up with in events, they actually have the heavy pieces way too far back covering the drop zone. So this piece would be touching the drop zone, that piece would be touching the drop zone, and then all you have is just one oil rig or one heavy wall trying to obscure and keep everyone safe. Because obviously you've got a fire lane here and then like a fire lane here. But if these terrain pieces were further back, you'd have huge fire lanes that make it really unsafe to push up and can be quite punishing to a lot of teams that aren't free APL or don't have like free ways to dash. But that's what I'm talking about when it comes to central heavy pieces. I remember they don't even have to be in the center of the board, especially if they're L pieces like this. They can actually
be offset like that and prescribe, and like as long as you've got another piece of like heavy terrain here, they can actually block off a huge part of the board from drop zone shooting. Because the main thing you want with these heavy pieces of terrain in the middle of the board is to deny people just taking shots at each other from the drop zone and not being able to move up. But I hope all that made sense, because, you know, last time I explained heavy pieces in the middle, I didn't really show any pictures, so this helps. But that's the general gist of it. So remember, you know, I'm just using Octaris as an example, and you can use anything, but heavy L shapes, because that's an L shape, you know, that would be great in the middle. Doesn't have to be exactly in the middle, offset. Even this was slightly offset as well. But that's what you can do to kind of use heavy terrain to the best of its ability. So when it comes to example terrain pieces, generally, when you're looking for a kill team board, you want terrain that's about 3 inches high and, you know, about 6 inches, 5 to 6 inches long. Generally, that height is good because, you know, I'm using Octaris as an example, but that is really well designed for kill team. Being effectively 3 inches tall allows a lot of miniatures to fit underneath, and with a 6 inch long wall, provides a lot of cover. Because generally when you're looking for terrain that, let's say, because you currently actually can't buy Octaris, so if you're looking for terrain at home, or terrain you want to make or buy from, or 3D print, or whatever you're doing, the best thing when it comes to kill team is you want kind of like a central tower, and like that central building can be a vantage point, can be a block, it can be a random shape, but as long as you've got one central piece. And then when you're looking for buildings, heavy pieces of buildings, you want buildings that are L-shaped. So the L shape is basically L, because you've got a long edge here and a short edge here. So it makes more sense if you look at it like that, because that's effectively an L. And then you've also got U shapes, which is more commonly seen with the Chow Naf terrain, which is effectively the L shape, but either there's a wall here or it's slightly longer with a wall there. And you want that kind of stuff just because it gives more places to hide. And, you know, especially when you've got flat angular buildings, the one good thing about GW terrain, you know, it does look visually great, but it's not actually completely flat. So you have lots of ways to tuck in to make yourself safe moving up the board instead of just everything being flat walls. But at least when it comes to L shapes and U shapes, you can have like, you know, single straight line walls, but it gives you more angles to hide from. So not everything is so angular. And one big advice when it comes to terrain, try and avoid stuff that is very flat in terms of the edges are really flat. Because the biggest problem when it comes to kill team, if you have everything that's just flat, like for example, when you've got Munitorium containers, they have a lot of indentations where you can actually hide, but like MDF versions are just flat blocks, which are actually really hard to use. So it's something to watch out for. But obviously the gold standard is Octaris, if you can still find it. But as I said, if you're looking for other terrain types, L shapes are great. They don't even have to be huge L's. Even if it's just a little bit sticking out, that's fine. L shapes and U shapes are the best. Generally, you want like 2 to 3 L shapes, or 2 to 4 L shapes, and then like maybe 2 U shapes if you can't get enough L shapes. It's that kind of general thing. And the greatest thing, if you're 3D printing terrain or scratch building your own, as long as you've got that footprint, you can go quite crazy with them and make up your own designs. So, you know, that's why it's kind of hard to recommend terrain, and it's better, I find, if you go for a specific style of terrain, because there's a lot of terrain that doesn't really work. I know like Morocco, the landing pad is a bit of an issue, but the buildings are really good. So it's kind of like give and take there. So I hope that kind of makes sense when I'm talking about terrain, because the one thing I don't want to do is lock people into a certain type of terrain, because there's, you know, terrain is expensive and there's a lot of choice. Some people build 3D print, don't even use GW, you know, it's whatever you find suits you. But when you're looking for terrain, try and look for shapes. You know, scramble piles are great if you can find like scrap piles, but generally you want like 1 to 2 towers and then like 3 to 4 of these, either L-shaped or L-shaped and U-shaped. And, you know, you should be pretty set, especially if you can get like some straight walls. So you've got a nice mix of light cover and then heavy vantage points.
So now I'll go over my own terrain layout. So what I've done with these layouts is should do an article version with this video, either on launch or just after, like later in the day. So what I've done is I designed 3 layouts that you guys can use at home, and I've made photos of them and also tabletop simulator versions in terms of images. So I'll quickly go through them and explain them to you. they're generally, so what I've done, instead of designing 9 maps, what I've designed is 3 maps. So 1 map for each layout. So, you've got, Hamburger, which is horizontal layouts. Then you've got diagonal, which is quesadilla layouts, and then Hotdog, which are vertical layouts, right? And what I've done is, instead of doing like 3 maps for each, I've done 1 for each. And generally these maps will work for all 3 mission types, right? For all 3 layouts for those types. You might want to tweak them a little bit, but what I've done is basically design them in a way where they don't have to be copied exactly, but I'll explain the quirks of the map when I go through each layout. You don't have to follow them, but that's how I designed them. And if you wanted to change them in your own way a bit, feel free. And if you want to give me some critiques, that'd be great as well, because while I won't be able to update them in the video, if I wanted to go and change them, I'd update them in the article. But the article is where you can find these images as well, if you wanted to have a quick reference instead of using this video. So let's get into the layouts. So when it comes to the horizontal map, or the hamburger layout, as you can see, both the top and bottom buildings and terrain are just blue on the edge of the drop zone. So basically they're effectively 3 inches away, so you can safely deploy everyone around. And so this is the picture version. So this is one I made with the camera, and then I'll transition to the TTS version, which has, slightly clearer with some changes. So as you can see, it's more clearly defined there. I kept the real photo to show, actually did make these, but there are some interesting tweaks I've put. So the gap between the largest scrap pile and the building, the vantage point next to it, there's a gap for about 32 mil base. So, basically anything that isn't a 40 mil base can squeeze through there, hinting at stuff. And, I'll get this out of the way. The big X's so these boards are designed, those big X's mean the vantage points aren't in use. So you can use them if you want to, but if you use those vantage points as vantage points, they completely really imbalance the boards and make them kind of too strong. So it's not overpowering, but it does give a strong edge. So you need to keep that in mind. But they still are building, so you can't fly through the floors. So you have to actually move around them. But that's the biggest tweak there. And then when you've got the small scramble pile with the top right building, that gap is just enough for a 25 mil base. So 25 mil base can walk around. And then in the top left corner, that gap is only enough for just a 25 mil base to walk around. So I've made some interesting tweaks, because obviously when I play at home, I don't use doors on Octarius, but you can. So the doors being on and off, that isn't an issue. The main thing about these layouts is where there's a big X, there's no vantage point. So that's the big issue there. But other than that, that's just a rough example of where you can place those boards and the terrain. So it should work on effectively all 3 layouts. And once again, because it's not exactly, you don't have to exactly place it to those dimensions. It means if there's, slight issues with the terrain, you can tweak it a bit, but generally it will work on all 3 layouts for horizontal hamburger deployment. And the key thing is there's no real way to get a shot. It looks a bit dodgy on the left-hand side if you're on the bottom drop zone, but actually that big building provides enough of obscuring, so the only way the opponent can get a shot is if they're sitting on the top or the bottom left corner of that top left terrain piece, and even then they can only just about hit the people on the edge of that wall in the bottom left drop zone. So generally you're quite safe moving up. Well, you're quite safe in your drop zone, and then moving up, there's a bit of open space, but you can kind of defend that with barricades, because the vantage points are blocked off. Next we come to the diagonal quesadilla deployment. Now it's quite different, because one thing I'll get to when I come to the board summary is that I've actually designed these boards so that they can easily be switched from one layout to the next. So actually you'll see I've designed these boards so they go from horizontal to diagonal and then vertical. So if you're a TO, these boards are actually designed to change really quickly from one layout to the other, because that's one suggestion I had. But as you can see with the diagonal drop zones, now I've gone to the TTS versions, the only things here that are really important. So the top barricade, the top light wall in the middle, That's not enough of a space for a 25mm base to move through. So anything larger can't. They'll have to traverse through. Once again, you can see the vantage points in the top left and bottom right corners are blocked off. And then the gap between the bottom right building and the oil tower is effectively enough for a 32mm base to walk around. So 32 and 25mm bases will have no issue. If you're 40mm or larger, you're either going to have to use the door if you're playing with doors, or they're just going to have to walk entirely around. So that's pretty simple for this drop zone, for this layout. But once again, you know, the vantage points are quite open and they do cover quite a bit, but it's really hard to use them effectively. And effectively, if you're going up there, you're going to get shot. But they don't cover the whole board. They cover big areas, but not dominating, if that makes sense. And you've still got safe drop zones where you can effectively move up quite safely. Because even if you look at the bottom left corner, you've got the oil rig, which will keep you safe, you know, as long as they can't ignore obscuring. So you can put barricades there. And it's the same for the top right corner, where you can actually deploy quite safely behind that light cover wall, because, you know, there's obscuring in the way, so you'll be fine. And now finally we come to the vertical hot dog deployment. So as you can see from the buildings, they're effectively just on the edge of the drop zone. So you've got 6-inch drop zones, you know, red, to safely deploy. Once again, the light barricade on the right hand side is kept safe by the obscuring oil tower, and those big vantage points are blocked off. I will quickly highlight on the TTS version where you can see where I've placed those scrap piles, and it doesn't show up great in the photos and the TTS version, but effectively the bottom building and the bottom scrap pile are just an inch away, which allows a 25mm base to move around. So that's one there. And then the top right corner, that base will allow, that gap will allow like a 32mm base through as well. So it's, you know, once again, penalizing 40mm bases, and especially the gap between the small scrap pile and the top right building, that will only allow 32mm base as well. So it's effectively, if something on a 40mm base tries to move around that small scrap pile, they're either going to have to scramble over or traverse through the light wall and stuff like that. So it's kind of minimalizing the power of a 40mm base. But let me show you the image. So as you can see, the largest scrap pile on the bottom right is almost just under the scrap, the building. But I've made it in such a way that isn't touching the door, because remember with the latest FAQ, you can't scramble through doors. So I've kept that free. And then the other one up top, just to make it a bit difficult if you are using doors. So doors aren't actually free. You're going to have to move around, but it still gives you some nice cover in case someone tries to move up and run. That's that drop zone. And because the vantage points that are blocked off are quite far forward, it allows you to be a bit safer with where you're placing your barricades and gives you some room to move up and apply pressure safely, even though there is quite a bit of dead space on that board. But yeah, those are my layouts. And the quickest thing I want to say about the layouts, once again, they'll be available in article format, but one of the key feedbacks I got from a lot of like TOs and stuff is they struggled copying layouts because they took a while to set up. So what I've done, as I said, you know, 3 layouts for all 9 mission types. But if you want to change your layouts, like you want to do one layout for everyone this round and the next, the way I've designed it, so if you start off with the horizontal layout, you can then quickly switch from horizontal to diagonal and then diagonal to vertical. And like once you're familiar with the layouts, it should only take about a minute or 2 to change a board from horizontal to vertical, and then horizontal to diagonal, and then diagonal to vertical layouts. So that's the key thing I actually did with these boards. And as I've said, they've got their own quirks that I've designed. But if you don't like that, I've made maps where it's hard for 40mm bases or gives advantage to 25mm bases, you don't have to do that. You can like change it so there's either no advantage for a 25mm base or allows more bases through. That's up to you, but that's how I've designed these maps. But I've done it in such a way that it's easy for TOs to switch layouts, but also gives you the leeway to tweak boards to make it better for you while still maintaining the same shape of that layout, which is why I haven't done exact measurements, just keying out where the drop zones are in the center of the borders. So hopefully those are helpful and useful to you. But yeah, that's pretty much it for my terrain guide update. Key points, once again, you know, try and keep Tac Ops scorable, so namely secure advantage and central control. Try and keep, if you're keeping drop zones like vantage points next to the drop zone. Never place them in the drop zone. Place them on the edge or outside. And if they're facing and they're actively vantage points, make sure they're facing towards the opponent open. So there's actually no cover to use them unless they're further forward. So the closer a vantage point is to the midline of the board, the safer it is for you to set it up with the cover facing the opponent. Because the worst thing is going like first activation, I move up from my drop zone like 4 inches, I'm on a vantage point now, and I can just shoot you safely. That's the kind of thing you want to decentivize. At least get into like close to the midline to get onto a vantage point, I think is a good trade, you know, just to stop the power advantages being overwhelming. And, you know, you want heavy pieces just, you know, in the middle. And you don't have to use GW terrain if you can use whatever you can source, as long as it's generally like you've got like 1 to 2 towerish terrain pieces and then like 4 L to U-shaped terrain pieces, you'll be fine, right? Obviously, Octaris is great if you can get a hold of it. But if you can't, finding like a generic piece of terrain that's L-shaped, that's at least 3 inches tall, you know, that'd be perfect, right? So it's trying to not lock you into any specific terrain type, but trying to make it kill team safe. And especially try to stay away from really flat, angular pieces of terrain. It's great if actually the terrain you can get has like lots of grooves and nooks and crannies to hide in, because it actually makes it safer to move people up. Because the worst thing, as I said, you know, the Munitorium container from GW is great for terrain because it's got all these ways to tuck in, but like the MDF versions are literally 3D like cuboids. Really hard to actually get cover from, especially when they're placed diagonally, so they actually become death traps. So it's something to remember. But once again, I'll keep this short and sweet. I'll have an article version of this either when the video goes up or a little bit later, which will have the images of the layouts that you can use. And once again, I may tweak the layouts going forward based on people's feedback, but if they are, they'll be in the article because obviously I can't update the video once the video is live. So I hope this is really helpful and provides a lot of guides, because this is actually the first time I've actually shared my layouts, and I'll be actually using them in battle reports as well, instead of just going, that's crazy. And, you know, who knows, I may start doing some for Chalnaf and Morok and stuff. The only thing, the reason I've done with Octaris, because you get enough terrain in the box to make a good board with Octaris, even though I'd like to add 1 or 2 more pieces to Octaris, because when it comes to Nakmund, I like the way GW at Warhammer World does it, because they add 3 Munitorium containers and another oil rig, all which I have, but that's not really feasible for a lot of players. And even Morok, I'm using extra terrain for that. So I thought at least with Octaris, generally everyone has 1 set of Octaris. That's why I've done that. And obviously I've designed it so these layouts are really good for TOs if you want to switch between them on round. And if you are using that as a TO, remember it goes horizontal, diagonal, vertical. But that's pretty much it from today. Please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of this update. Did you find it useful or helpful? Please let me know. And remember, I've got a Discord you can check out below in the episode description for free, as well as an affiliate link to Element Games, as well as a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. So I'll quickly shout out my patrons. So for my Adepts of the Crit, I have Tool Bardin, Sam, Robin, Ninja Lee 83, Nick, Kenzie, John Thomas, Eric, Captain Murder, Dad of Goldens, Average Joe 27, and Arthur. And then for my Veterans of the Crit, I have Sam Jethers. Thank you so much. Your support really means a lot to me and helps support the channel. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me today. This is a lot of work because I packed it in way too quickly because I have a really busy week, but I want to get a lot of stuff out of the way. It's technically I've done 2 guides in a week because I've done the Space Marine guide and now this. So I'll be back with more content soon. Hopefully it really helps. I've tried to, you know, properly go with my information, so hopefully that helps. But I'm really interested to see how people find it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And remember, no matter how your terrain is laid out, remember, there's always a chance to win, as long as you can roll a crit.